Welcome to Abstract Essay, where ideas take shape, thoughts find depth, and every conversation explores the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. She's a UK and US political commentator, no other than Miss Leah Brown. Welcome, Miss Leah Brown on Abstract Essay. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, my name is Leah Brown, and I run a change management consultancy called the Wayfinders Group. I'm also a professional speaker, a writer, a podcast host, and I work predominantly in organizational repair.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about what's your advice for leaders facing their first major crisis. So tell us, in the initial chaotic moments of a crisis, what specific mental frameworks or practices are most critical for a leader to project calm and project confidence, even they were feeling terrified internally?
Yeah, so I think if you're facing your first major crisis as a leader, you probably need to start with radical honesty about what you don't know, because that first crisis is going to expose gaps in your knowledge. It's going to expose gaps in your capabilities. It's not weakness, it's information. And so, a leader who is able to navigate a crisis is one who can say, I don't know yet, but here are the steps that I'm taking to find out, rather than pretending that you have all the answers. And there are three questions that, if you find yourself in that situation, you should be asking immediately. Number one, what harm has actually occurred? Number two, who has been affected and how have they been affected? And number three, what systems or relationships have broken down?
Interesting questions, Ms. Leah. And how can a new leader authentically acknowledge the severity of a situation and their own uncertainty without eroding the team's confidence in their ability to navigate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is so much pressure in a crisis situation, but you really need to resist the theatrics. One of the mediation mantras I love is go slow to go fast. There's going to be so much pressure to look decisive and to make an immediate statement and to cut somebody off or make a public apology. But actually, if you act immediately in an outward facing way, that can often cause more harm. So before you announce anything, take time to understand the full picture. Speak to the people who've been most affected. Map the actual breakdown, not just the symptoms of the breakdown. And this is where many leaders stumble because it's easy to confuse activity with progress. But real crisis response requires you to strategically slow down so that you can speed up effectively.
Is speed up effectively in the midst of turmoil? And what practical techniques can leader use to avoid catastrophic fight or flight reaction and ensure their first critical decisions are driven by logic and analysis, not pure panic?
Well, I think you need to recognize whether or not you need specialist intervention, right? So, this is why it's so important to know the team that you have around you before you're in a crisis. Because if you have some people who are really good about managing crises, they maybe experienced them in personal lives or professional lives prior to this, they can be really useful in helping you navigate this. But if you have someone on your team who crumbles at the mere mention of a scandal, they're probably not the people that you want to be delegating to right now. So I think often people don't bring an external party in soon enough. So you need to know if your existing team has the right skills for this. And if they don't, it's not their fault. But I do think that it depends on the scandal. So if the scandal or the crisis is leadership breakdown or some kind of toxicity in the workplace, maybe a bullying or a harassment scandal, or maybe it's shattered customer trust, you probably need more than damage control. And there are people who specialize in helping you address that, whether that's a risk management organization, a lawyer, an organizational repair specialist like us at the Wayfinders Group. You need people who can turn this crisis into enabling you to create a high performance organization that bounces back from it.
High performance for sure, and a leader often bears the ultimate weight of responsibility alone. How should they manage the intense feeling of isolation to avoid burnout and maintain sound judgment?
I think maintaining trust is really helpful in this situation. And you've got to remember that everything that you think you know going into the crisis does not hold true. So if you say to somebody in the middle of a crisis, trust me, I've got this, that's
Yes.
not going to mean anything to them. It will only mean something if you are demonstrating accountability. So that means that you're going to have to say, I'm acknowledging this harm clearly. I'm not being defensive or I'm not blaming somebody else. Here are the processes that I'm creating to understand what went wrong. Here's who was involved in designing the solutions. Here's when I'll tell you more. When's the next communication touch point? And here's how I'm going to follow through on what I've committed. That's what kind of builds trust here, not grand gestures, not things said over the tannoy, but through consistent, reliable behavior. So you've got to show people that you're trustworthy at the helm, and that will really help in stabilizing. Now, you mentioned loneliness. It is really, really lonely to be a leader in a crisis situation. You need to know who you can trust. You need to know who you can confide in. Maybe you have advisors around the table. Maybe you have a supportive board. Maybe you have good external legal counsel. But you need to be able to communicate to somebody who's got your back so that you have somewhere to offload and somewhere that you feel supported so that you can carry the weight of whatever the organization is going through.
Miss Leia, on communication and transparency, what are the essential elements that must be included in every first communication to your team and stakeholders when crisis breaks? What is the single most important message to convey?
What you know, what's going to happen next, when you're going to provide the next update. That's fairly generic, but again, it's very crisis specific. The question that you've asked, I think people want to know who's responsible for what's going on around them. They want to know, if you don't know more right now, when are you going to know more, and when can we expect the next update? By communicating that last bit, what you are basically doing is creating enough time and space for you to go away and solve some of the problems in the interim without everyone badgering you for an update because they don't know when the next update is coming.
So, how do you strike the right balance between being transparent about the grim realities of the crisis and providing enough hope and direction to keep the team motivated and focused?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I mean, I think again it depends on the crisis, but not everybody needs to know everything, and not everybody is affected by the crisis. So I think having really clear stakeholder groups that you decide what you're communicating to. So, for example, if the crisis only relates to the finance function, the rest of the business probably doesn't need to know about it, but the board definitely needs to know about it, and your senior management team probably needs to know about it. The other thing that you have to do is not give your employees something to whistle blow to the press with. So you have to manage internal and external comms on a need to know basis. Oh no.
So, Miss Leia, okay, I think, yeah, let's continue. When faced with the urgent question for which you have no answer, what is the most effective way to say, I don't know, without appearing incompetent or evasive?
I think humility is really important. And I think if you say, I know that this is my responsibility and I don't know the answers here, but I have surrounded myself with the people who do have the answers, I think that can be really helpful. But I also think that, again, you need to know who you can trust and you need to know what you don't have in your top team so you can find that externally. And I think often bringing in an external supplier can really give people confidence that you are going to resolve the crisis and that you do know what you're doing. And I think so often leaders think that it has to be intrinsic to them. They have to have everything, they have to know how to do everything themselves, that the crisis itself becomes another crisis because they're not equipped to deal with it.
In a crisis, action feels paramount. Why is active, intentional listening to your team, customers, and critics actually more powerful leadership tool than talking into the early stages?
I mean, crisis reveals what's already been broken, right? It's rare that a major crisis causes organizational dysfunction. It just exposes what has been wrong all along. And so it's your stakeholders that will confirm where the problems are, or which systems failed, or which relationships have been fractured, or where trust has broken down. I think they are also well placed to help you address the vulnerabilities because you need to prioritize how you work towards repair. But there are a lot of people who find the noise of all of those difficult stakeholders overwhelming. And so I think you have to be curious as a leader. I think you need to work out, okay, what does this breakdown in systems or in relationships tell us about how we need to change? Because the best leaders recognize, yes, that they're in a crisis, but that crisis presents an opportunity to do things better than they were before. And so I think you need to have a short, a medium, and a long term view with respect to each of the stakeholders. And you need to keep your head about you, and you need to prioritize in keeping with your leadership what you think is most important to drive the organization forward.
On strategy and action, what is the effective framework for tri- triaging or triggering the avalanche of problems a crisis presents? How do you distinguish between what is critical, important, and distraction?
That's a really difficult question. How do you triage? It's something that I find very difficult myself. I mean, I think you also need to divide it into buckets of what you can do and what's in your control and what isn't in your control. Often, crises happen at really inconvenient times. So it might be on a Friday night and you might have a cybersecurity breach. There are going to be certain things that you cannot do until Monday. So you need to consider, okay, who can I contact? Who is available? Who can come into the office? What can we be doing over the weekend? Okay, maybe we need to contact all of our customers and tell them that there's been a data breach. Okay, maybe we need to contact our finance systems to let them know that there are vulnerabilities in our infrastructure. We can do all of those things. We can contact our insurance provider, but we might not be able to take all of the steps today. We can probably convene an emergency board meeting. We need to work out who is going to be affected by this cybersecurity breach. So those kinds of things, I think, help with the triaging. I think it's also really helpful to have a really good comms person around you who can help you decide what needs to be said when. So, if you have a cybersecurity breach, for example, and you're telling all of your customers that there's been a breach, well, what are you going to tell your employees? Somebody needs to focus on what you're telling your employees because there's nothing worse than being an employee reading something about your company in the press that hasn't come from your company's leaders.
Should a leader centralize decision making for speed or decentralize it for agility? How do you quick assemble and empower a core team to execute the crisis response effectively?
Yeah, I think that's really important. If you look at something like the police or the fire stations, they always have somebody who's point of contact, and I think it's really helpful. Usually, again, that will be the comms person or possibly the head of people who will be responsible for stakeholders to contact. So whether that's media inquiries, whether that's the board, who is the first port of call? Because if the CEO is running around trying to make sure that everything, all the ducks are in the row, or triaging, or getting more information, or approving extra spend, they're probably not going to have capacity to be responding to customer queries or employee questions. So I think it's really important to nominate somebody as the point of contact who also has a direct line to the CEO or the chair of the board to keep them informed on what's coming in from external stakeholders and employees.
Miss Leia, on leading the team and organization, how can leader foster an environment where team members feel safe to report bad news, admit mistakes, and propose unconventional ideas without fear of blame?
Yeah, this is a trust building question. And again, it's really important that leaders do this before they're in the crisis. Otherwise, it's really, really hard to build trust in the crisis. I think it's really important for people to do what they say that they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. I also think it's important to create space for questions. Oftentimes, diktats come down from management, and the general employee group actually have really good suggestions on how things could work better. So, to involve people in that conversation and to consult with them as to rollouts or changes or developments can be a really great way to build trust. I think curiosity about how the team members are experiencing the leadership that requires a bit of vulnerability, to say, I don't know you very well, but I really want to make sure that you have an opportunity to tell me if there's something that you don't like about the way that I'm leading, or the way that we had that company all hands, or there is an opportunity for you to share your concerns if you have any. And it's not so much to invite criticism, but it's more to build a relationship. I think trust requires relationship, and so often people demand respect without recognizing where there is a delta between what they're giving and what they need to give.
Mr. Leia, what are the key signs of a team burnout to watch for during a prolonged crisis, and what practical steps can leader to take to manage energy and morale over the long haul?
I mean, I think the key signs of team burnout is complete disengagement, or murmurings on social media, or an unwillingness to turn up to work at all, or it's usually evidenced in productivity. I mean, if you take a company like Boeing, for example, where whistleblowers weren't able to, let's say, be protected, that has a huge impact on a team's willingness to speak up, even if that is one of the company's cultures. I think it depends on what the issue is as to how that burnout manifests. But usually it's a symptom of working really hard and trying to keep it all together in a really stressful environment without recognition, without praise, without a promise of compensation for overtime, or without a recognition of where somebody stepped up and maybe started leading a team because their line manager doesn't have capacity. So I think, again, it's really important for the chief people officer to be involved in this, to be a litmus test for what the people in the organization are experiencing. Sometimes people just need to be given permission to not be involved. Sometimes people just need to just have a Friday off. And sometimes people just need to be told to kind of get on with it, because the only way out of the crisis is if we all pull together, and here's how long we need to sprint for. So I think there are lots of different ways that you can address team burnout, but it's really very specific to the type of crisis that the organization is facing.
Miss Leia, on learning and legacy in the midst of relentless action, what does a simple but effective after action review process look like that allows the team to learn and adapt in near real time?
Yeah, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work in thinking about how to recover from difficult situations using our four-stage blueprint. And I think it's relevant here. I mean, any form of reflection after something heinous has happened, the four A's are acknowledgement, apology, accountability, and amends. And I think any team who's gone through something, it can be really helpful to have a team dialogue to say, okay, can we just acknowledge what has happened here? How much energy and time and capacity this situation has taken from us, how at risk we felt our jobs were, or how scared we were about what was going to happen next. And actually, the companies admitted that it didn't communicate very well. Maybe they're asking for an apology from their leaders. Maybe their leader is somebody who just completely buckles in a crisis and has been completely disconnected and dissociated from everything that's happened, and maybe went on sick leave, right? So you need to both acknowledge that, but you also need to make an apology for that. And sometimes employees might seek that. But then there's also this accountability. What does it look like to ensure this doesn't happen again? What preventative steps can we take? Is there training we need to do? Have we changed our suppliers? Was it a leadership failing that gave rise to this crisis? How did this come to be? And then the amends part is the outworking of how we process that accountability. What can we do differently? How can we work together to ensure something like this doesn't happen again? And what amends do we need to take for the way that this situation has affected our people?
Why is it critically important to document decisions, assumptions, and key communications as the crisis unfolds, both for legal protection and for the future learning?
Yeah, I think it's as you've said it. I think it's important to document the communications both for insurance purposes and for legal purposes and for the board's record. And so that you can point to here are all the steps that we did take. I think a lot of times leaders are criticized in hindsight. We all have the benefit of hindsight, but in real time, we always have to admit that everyone is doing the best that they can with the information that they have, with the amount of pressure that they are under. And I think having communication clearly documented enables you to go back and actually reflect and be curious about, hey, was this a good decision? Or how could we have done this differently? Or if we needed to do this again, what systems and processes can we put in place to ensure that we already have a playbook for what comes next? And I think without that kind of documenting it, you will forget. Crises are really stressful situations and environments, and nobody wants to be in those for any longer than they have to be. And so, what we want to do is ensure that we have a record so that we can point to it, but also so that we can improve later down the line.
What are the signals that the acute crisis phase is over and the organizations is moving into recovery and rebuilding? How does leadership strategy need to shift at that point?
Can you repeat the question?
What are the signals that the acute crisis phase is over and the organizations is moving into recovery and rebuilding?
I think the press stops calling. That's usually a good sign. And also, you'll see a collective exhale from the chief financial officer about feeling like things are suddenly under control. I mean, I think sometimes it's a practical situation. So there's been a power outage, or you've got something like a pandemic. And so you've got to see what's going on around you as to whether or not that phase has passed. I think it's ultimately when leadership says that it's over, when all of the boxes have been ticked, and maybe the insurance payout has come, or maybe the affected leader who caused the crisis has been fired, or maybe all of the customers' data has been restored. There's always a trigger point to say, here's where we're trying to get to in resolving this crisis. Once you know what the root of the problem is, and I think at that point, then you can say, okay, now we need to stop and we need to take stock of how can we put in steps to ensure that this doesn't happen in this way again, and how do we go through that framework that I just identified. If you try to do that too prematurely, it can be really counterproductive. I think you also have to create a little bit of space from the situation before you launch into, okay, how do we prevent this? Because there are a lot of people who find a crisis at work the most difficult thing that they will ever go through, much harder than things at home, because they're just not expecting to have to deal with that at work, or they haven't ever experienced that before in their professional lives. And so it can really churn up people's appetite for remaining in the workplace. But I think when people are ready to start spending time together again, and socialize and talk at the water cooler, and not, are able to laugh about what's happened, that's probably when it's time to move on.
So, Miss Leah, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to listen to my other podcast, people, my other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well, geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast, law 101 and mental health 101. Love Letters in third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. So, Miss Leia, ultimately, what does a leader owe to themselves and their organizations in terms of reflecting on the experience? How can they emerge from their first major crisis, not to just a survivor, but a significant, wiser, and more capable leader?
I think you need honesty with yourself and the people around you. I think you need humility for yourself as to how you think you did in that process and what you could have done better or differently. And then I think you need help. It's really difficult to objectively assess your own performance in a crisis. Bring in somebody external to facilitate those conversations and to help you work through it and to create a workable strategy for how you want to repair and move forwards from there.
Ms. Leah Brown, a UK and US political commentator, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to support your podcast, your advocacy, or whatever projects that you're doing right now?
Yes, very happy to. We are just about to launch a new organizational repair training program called the Clear Paths Method. And we are also doing a lot of work in politics. Please follow Address the Harm podcast and watch out for our campaign launching in forthcoming weeks.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Leah Brown because if you support her, for sure, more and more empowering episode of the podcast, more and more empowering advocacy to come. So, Miss Leah, thank you so much for your time. More to come, people. See you soon.